Now that we've had a look at the different groups of organisms that make up life on our planet, we're going to take a look at how they interact with each other and how they interact with their environment. And that, of course, is known as ecology. We'll start by taking a look at the hierarchy of biology. Remember that a hierarchy consists of a group that contains smaller groups, etc. So starting at the top, the largest subdivision within this hierarchy would be the biosphere. The biosphere is the portion of the planet that's inhabited by life. So we're talking about the lower portion of the atmosphere. We're talking about the surface of the earth and the soil. We're talking about the oceans and lakes, etc. Now we could study the recycling of carbon and oxygen and water and other important substances within this thin film that covers the entire planet. The biosphere has a metabolism. The Earth has a metabolism. In cells, we have what's called homeostasis. Homeostasis is a negative feedback cycle. So we have lots of negative feedback cycles that help maintain the conditions within a cell or within your body. For instance, if you are too hot, you sweat, and that cools you down. If you're too cold, you will shiver, and that will warm you up. We have the same sort of negative feedback loops that occur on the planet. For instance, if there's lots of carbon dioxide, we get more plant growth, and that removes the carbon dioxide. So a negative feedback loop is where we have this cycle that helps bring us back to kind of a happy average. It brings us back to this midpoint. Positive feedback loops exacerbate a change. They make a change occur faster. We talked about ice ages before. Remember, we talked about the fact that if the Earth gets cooler, then we get more snow. The Earth has this white reflective surface on it because of the extra snow, and that bounces back more sunlight out into space. Things get cooler, we get even more snow. So that's a positive feedback loop where the change kind of builds upon itself. But for the most part, we have negative feedback cycles that help maintain this biosphere. Now, unfortunately, as we'll talk about later, humans have made some changes to those negative feedback loops. We have interrupted a lot of this negative feedback homeostasis. The biosphere is not a closed system, and what I mean by that is it's not self-contained, really. A closed system is where we don't have any inputs and we don't have any outputs. But we do have a very large input, and that would be sunlight. So sunlight fuels photosynthesis, and photosynthesis fuels most of the life on the planet. Think about what you ate today. You ate plants, or maybe something that ate a plant, or something that was derived from a plant or derived from something that ate a plant, or derived from something that ate a plant, etc. But it all goes back to photosynthetic organisms, and not just plants, but also algae, cyanobacteria, etc. So we have this constant input of photons of light, and also the light warms the earth. It warms it unevenly, and that's why we have distinct biomes. We'll talk about those in a second, and that's also responsible for winds and ocean currents, etc. We have some materials that come from space, meteorites. And we talked about the impact, so to speak, that meteorites have had on the history of the planet. But even today, we have lots of tiny little meteorites the size of dust, and that's adding material to the Earth. Continuing on with our hierarchy, our next step down would be biomes. A biome is a major regional or global biotic community. And we can identify a biome by the types of plants that we see and the type of animal life that we see and the prevailing climate. So for instance, in the northern hemisphere, we have a band of boreal forest that wraps around the Earth. And above that, we have a band of tundra. And below that, we have a band of temperate forest, and then below that, tropical forest, etc. Biomes are made up of ecosystems. And an ecosystem would be a collection of communities and abiotic factors. Communities are groups of organisms. Abiotic means without life. So here we're talking about things like pH and chemistry and climatic conditions. So for instance, all of the organisms living and interacting within a given area, a forest, a lake, something like that, and all of the abiotic factors that they interact with would make up an ecosystem. So again, we've got the biosphere. That's made up of biomes, and biomes are made up of ecosystems. Moving on, we have communities. So again, ecosystems consist of living organisms and abiotic factors. Now we're taking abiotic factors out of the equation. We're just looking at communities, which are populations of different species living in the same area. Now I used to live in Edmonton for a little while, and what you see here is a scene from Elk Island Provincial Park, which is just outside of Edmonton. The community would consist of all the living stuff you see here: the trees, the grasses, the flowers, the bison, mice, insects. Everything in that region makes up a community. Continuing down our hierarchy, we could talk about populations. A population is a group of organisms of the same species inhabiting a given area. So continuing my last example, let's say that that given area is Elk Island Provincial Park. So we could look at just the bison that live in Elk Island Park. Next, we could look at the individual organisms that make up that population. So we could look at just a single living thing that's part of this population. Now we could have been talking about populations of flowers and then singled into one flower, or we could have been talking about populations of bacteria maybe and then singled in on a single cell. But in this case, we're talking about the bison here. So we've got this single bison, and that would be the organismal level. Now we could go lower than this. We could talk about the organism itself, talk about organ systems, talk about organs, talk about tissues, then talk about cells, then talk about the parts of the cells like the mitochondria, etc. Then talk about the molecules that make them up and then the atoms, but we're not going to get into that with ecology. We're just going to leave it here at the organism. Let's have a look at some of the different fields of ecology, and they align pretty well with the hierarchy that we just talked about. So if you are an ecologist, you might study global ecology. And here you're concerned about the biosphere. So for instance, if your research is focused on climate change, you would be quite interested in changes in the biosphere. If you're a landscape ecologist, you're focused in on a much smaller area of the planet. You might be looking at a major city, for instance. If we compare a city to the natural environment, of course we have less biodiversity because things are paved over, but also we have a difference in the microclimate. So you're looking at interactions between physical properties of that artificial environment and how that changes the ecosystems that would have otherwise been there. For instance, if we look at the water cycle, if we have a natural environment, much of the water is going to infiltrate into the soil and into deeper layers and recharge the groundwater. Some of the water is going to be runoff. It's going to run along the surface into streams and lakes and so on. And quite a bit of it is going to be evaporated or transpirated by plants. Now, what that means is it's water that's given off from the leaves of plants. If we compare that to what happens in an urban area, we tend to have impervious ground cover. We have concrete and asphalt. Now that means that a lot less of the water is able to go into groundwater, and a lot more runs off into streams and rivers. And it does that very quickly. If we get a major rainstorm, the water immediately runs into streams and rivers, and we get flooding. We get this big change in how rivers and lakes and so on behave. We also get this heating up of the asphalt. Typically in an urban area, in a big city, it's several degrees warmer than the surrounding rural areas. Next, we have ecosystem ecology. Ecologists that work in this field might be interested in how energy flows through the ecosystem. So how much material, how much biomass is produced by plants? And how is that passed from one level to the next? So of course the plants are going to be eaten by herbivores, they're going to be eaten by carnivores. What's the energy flow within this community? But also they're looking at the abiotic factors, the non-living factors. How are microbes in the soil affecting the acidity of the soil? So they're looking at all of these complex interactions. Next, we have community ecology. So here we're focused on just the organisms. We might be looking at how changes affect the greater community. So for instance, what if we have the loss of a certain herbivore? For some reason, its numbers are reduced. How is that going to affect the carnivores? How is that going to affect the rest of the food web? We'll talk about that later. Or what if we have a physical change? Maybe we have a hurricane or a tornado and it knocks down some trees, and now we have an open space and new organisms are going to move into that space and colonize it. So we're looking at these relationships between organisms. Then we have population ecology. So here we're looking at a certain population of organisms. A lot of conservation biology would fall into this category. Maybe we have a species that's in trouble. Maybe it's one that's being hunted to near extinction. How are we going to help preserve that particular species and increase the size of these populations? We also look at how populations change over time, how their numbers change, how their density changes, and we might try to figure out and maybe regulate the factors that affect population number. Finally, we have organismal ecology, and this is focusing on the individual organism. We might look at behaviors. So how are behaviors related to reproductive success? We could study mating behaviors, for instance. We could look at the physiology of the organism and how does that affect its success. Let's take a look at climate now. As mentioned before, we have these climate bands around the planet that determine where certain biomes will be found. And these climate bands are the result of the uneven heating of the Earth's surface, as we'll see. That affects precipitation patterns, it affects weather patterns, etc. When we're talking about climate, we could talk about macroclimate, and that again would consist of these major bands of biomes across the planet. So we have these areas that have a consistent level of rainfall, consistent winter and summer temperatures, etc. But we could also talk about microclimate. Within any region, within a forest, within a lake, whatever, we have different climates over a very small area. So for instance, in a forest, if you're looking at temperature under a log, that's going to be quite different from the temperature of the forest floor just a meter away. That's an example of microclimate. Microclimates are highly localized. Areas that are meters apart or even centimeters apart might have very different temperatures and humidities. In the top left there, we're seeing a tidal pool. So the tide comes in, fills this little pool, tide goes out, and of course the conditions within that little pool are quite different from the conditions of the ocean. We have lots of sunlight coming in, heating up those rocks. It's going to be warmer. The water is going to evaporate, and by the end of the day, before the tide comes back in, might be quite a bit saltier in that little pool. In the top middle, we've got a little hole in a rotten log, and we've got some fungus living in there. It's dark, it's moist, and that fungus is probably quite happy there, but it might not be as happy just a few centimeters to the left or to the right. In the upper right, we've got a desert situation here, very, very hot during the day. If you look carefully, you can see a lizard hiding out in that shadow. It's several degrees cooler in that little shadow. That's its own little microclimate that this lizard has found. Down the bottom on the left, you can see Los Angeles there on the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean soaks up a lot of heat, and that means that it has a cooling effect on the area around it during the day. At night, it re-radiates some of that heat. So right next to the ocean, we have cooler temperatures during the day, warmer temperatures at night, and the temperature doesn't fluctuate as much as it does as we move away from the ocean. And finally, in the bottom, on the right, we have an urban environment. Now, this is actually Quesnel, so I don't know how urban that would be, but even small cities and towns affect the climate. I mentioned before that when we have lots of impervious surfaces, we have water that runs off right into lakes and rivers and so on. It's not soaked into the soil. We have concrete and asphalt that soak up heat and re-radiate it. And even in a small town, we can have temperatures that are a few degrees warmer during the day than the surrounding area. If we look at lakes or oceans, we have well-defined zones that have different climatic conditions. They're microclimates. If we look at a lake, around the shore of the lake, we have shallow water where plants can root. We have something called the photic zone, and that's where light penetrates freely through the water. So that will support plant life on the shores, but also it will support what are called phytoplankton. Those are algae and other photosynthetic microbes floating around in the water. And they form the basis of a lot of food chains. If we go to the bottom of a very deep lake, we have what's called the benthic zone. Not nearly as much light here, and also the water is much cooler. Now, interestingly, cold water is able to better dissolve oxygen. So the benthic zone can have more oxygen than the photic zone. So we have differences here. We have zones, we have layers that differ with respect to the amount of light, the amount of oxygen, and the temperature. We see, of course, the same thing in the oceans. We have the photic zone, where we have plankton. We have the benthic zone, and of course at the bottom of the oceans it's pitch black. Very, very different environment, no photosynthesis. Mostly in the benthic zone of the oceans we have decomposition. Whales will fall down to the bottom and be decomposed, etc. Also, in an ocean environment along the shore, we have an intertidal zone. So the tide comes up, the water comes in, it fills those little pools, goes back out. This is a somewhat harsh condition to live in, but it is a well-defined microclimate. Where we are in British Columbia, we have two mountain ranges. We have the coastal range and the Rocky Mountains, and they have a huge impact on local climate. We have fairly warm, moist air coming in off of the Pacific Ocean. Warm air carries more moisture. The air is forced up over mountain ranges, and what happens is the air, as it climbs up the side of the mountain, cools, and it can't hold as much moisture. Clouds form and the moisture falls as precipitation. Now, as the air continues to move over the mountain range, it loses most of its moisture, it falls down the other side and warms up and becomes very dry. So we have what's called a rain shadow. Now what that means is the leeward side of the mountains, so downwind, is a very dry climate. And on the coast side of the mountain ranges, it's a very wet climate. So in parts of British Columbia, of course, we have temperate rainforests. So the two sides of the mountain have very different climates. Let's have a look at macroclimate. I mentioned that macroclimate is the result of the uneven heating of the Earth. The Earth is a sphere, the surface is curved, and light that hits towards the poles is spread out over a larger area. So what you're seeing on this diagram here are these beams of light that represent a certain amount of energy. Let's take a look at what happens at the equator. We have this beam of light coming in, and it's spread over this surface here. Now compare that to that same amount of energy coming in towards the pole. It's spread over a much larger area. Same amount of energy, but spread over a greater area. The other thing to note is the amount of atmosphere that the light passes through. At the equator, it passes through the atmosphere directly. It hits it perpendicular. But at the poles, it passes through a much thicker layer of atmosphere. Again, just because of that angle. And the atmosphere is going to absorb some of that energy and also reflect it, especially if we have lots of cloud cover. So the end result is that energy from the sun is spread out over a greater distance at the poles so that the poles are cooler. When air warms up, it expands. It becomes less dense, it becomes more buoyant, and it rises. Hot air rises. Now, as the air rises up from the equator, the hottest point, air comes in to replace it. So we can see that here we have air rushing in to replace it, and that creates winds. Now, also what's happening is the air at the equator that's heated up, it rises and it circulates. It travels north in this case and then back down. As it travels up, it loses moisture. It drops moisture, and we get these tropical zones around the equator. That dry air drops back down, and we have these desert zones. And then the air is pulled back in towards the equator and sucked back up again. So we get this circulation of air. We get air rising, dropping moisture at the equator, falling back down about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, and that dry air creates desert conditions. And we get these wind patterns that are set up by this uneven heating as well. A similar thing happens in the oceans. The oceans are heated at the equator, and we have currents. We have movement of water that results from the ocean water expanding. This uneven heating is also responsible for the seasons. The Earth spins around its axis, and the axis runs from pole to pole. Now the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees with respect to this pole, and that tilt remains exactly the same as the Earth circles around the sun. Now what this means is that during our summer in the northern hemisphere, the northern half of the Earth is tilted towards the sun, and during our winter, the northern half is pointed away from the sun. And that means that the light is spread out more during the winter, and we have cooler conditions in the northern hemisphere. Of course, for the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. So during December, which would be winter for us, they have summer because the southern hemisphere is pointed towards the sun. And during June, the southern hemisphere has winter because they are pointed away from the sun. The Earth's biomes are a result of the annual mean or average temperature and the annual mean precipitation. And in this graph, you can see the two plotted against each other. So for instance, deserts, we have low precipitation and high temperatures. Tundra, we have low precipitation and low temperatures. All of this is once again the result of the uneven heating of the Earth. It's a result of the fact that the Earth is a sphere, it's curved. We have our differences in how much area the heat is spread over, but again we also have those cycles, the precipitation cycles that we just discussed. Humans have had an impact on global climate. When we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Now what that means is it traps heat. So think of a greenhouse. Light comes in from the sun, it goes through the glass, it heats up the interior of the greenhouse, and that heat, that infrared radiation, can't get back out through the glass, so the greenhouse heats up. Carbon dioxide has a similar property. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can trap heat that is given off by the Earth's surface. Over time, it does appear that the temperature of the Earth on a global scale has been increasing. That's also affected precipitation cycles. So we have definitely seen some global changes. Climate, of course, affects the distribution of populations and communities. Take a look at this example here. We have the map of Australia, and you're seeing the distribution of kangaroos. Obviously, they have preferences. Those preferences are based on rainfall and also temperature. So kangaroos, like all organisms, are sensitive to abiotic factors and biotic factors, living factors. And those biotic factors are also, of course, affected by climate. Kangaroos want to be where their food is, and their food, the plants they eat, have requirements when it comes to the amount of precipitation and the temperature. Kangaroos don't want competition. Also, it'd be nice if they didn't have predators. So the community that appears based on climate is going to determine where kangaroos are happiest. We'll talk more about what limits the range of a species in our next topic. But here's a quick little flowchart that will lead us into that discussion. So if a species is absent from an area, we have to think about several reasons why that might be. First of all, was there a human disturbance, or was there a disease or something like that? But assuming there wasn't, we have to think about, is there something that limits their distribution, their ability to disperse? Or is there some sort of behavior that limits their distribution? Or perhaps there's biotic factors, the presence of other species. That could be food species, or it could be predators. Is there parasitism, competition, disease, something like that going on that's keeping them out of this area? Are there abiotic factors that limit distribution? Maybe the temperatures are too hot for them to handle. Maybe it's a pH that they can't handle, some sort of chemical requirement that they need that's not there. If we're talking about plant species, maybe they don't have enough light in that area, or the soil doesn't contain the correct minerals, etc. So figuring out why organisms live where they do can be a rather complex process, as we'll see. Okay, this has been a rather quick introduction to ecology. Let's summarize what we talked about. Ecology is the study of complex interactions between organisms and also between the organisms and their non-living physical environment. Ecology can be studied on a wide range of scales. There's several fields of study within ecology. Abiotic and biotic factors determine the environmental range of species. Climate sets up well recognizable established biomes. I haven't used this term yet, but biogeography is the study of species distribution. So literally, we're looking at life as it relates to geography. And we also study how these distributions change over time. If climate changes, for instance, the range of a species can change. Lastly, here's some terminology. And I will see you next time when we continue talking about ecology.